May 1943, southern England after a Luftwaffe bombing raid. Lieutenant Margaret Hale stood by the supply cabinet gloves, cold against her skin. The night's bombing had been heavier. The boys from the airfield still came in, faces blackened, half frozen from the raids. A truck ground to a halt outside. Brakes squealed, voices called for stretchers. Guards climbed down their coats streaked with mud. 3 German airmen lay in the back under stiff blankets. One still breathed. The sergeant handed her a clipboard. Orders from the brass ma'am. Enemy patients minimal treatment. His tone was flat mechanical. Margaret hesitated, pencil, hovering before pressing down. The stretcher passed boots thudding on the floor. From beneath the blanket came a faint moan. Burns, a corpsman muttered. 3rd degree. Won't last the night. The smell of scorched cloth drifted through the ward. Margaret turned to sort bandages. Private Jenkins cracked a joke about roasting the enemy. A few laughed, most didn't. Keeping her head down was survival, follow orders, keep moving, never think too long about who lay there. Yet the laughter's echo clung to the room. Later she walked past the isolation wing. Through the cracked glass, the boy lay still, skin mottled red and ash. His tag read, H. Richter Luftwaffe. He couldn't be 20. It wasn't her concern. Americans came first. But her feet refused to move. The faint lift of his chest, shallow, defiant, held her there. Dr. Morse appeared behind her with a clipboard. Go home, Lieutenant. You've done enough. She nodded. He's the enemy, he said softly. Let the order stand. No reply came. Wind rattled the canvas. A bell rang for night rounds. Margaret hung her stethoscope, stepped into the narrow corridor. Floorboards creaked under her boots. Her shadow stretched and broke across the lights. In the officer's room, stale coffee mixed with ink. On the desk, the directive glared up: enemy patients receive minimal treatment. The words lost meaning, turning to noise. A nurse murmured a prayer before collapsing on her cot. Margaret sat on hers, eyes open. The hum of the generator gnawed at the silence. Margaret thought of her brother in Kansas, his grin when he enlisted, promising to keep the world safe for people like her. Would anyone show him mercy if he fell into enemy hands? By morning, the German pilot had been moved to the isolation wing. No one volunteered there. Rumors spread fast. In the mess hall, voices carried over tin cups and cold coffee. Some called him the enemy flyer. Others didn't bother with a name. One joked that his burns had saved the Allies a bullet. The laughter came short and uneasy. In the nurse's tent, her colleagues folded sheets and whispered. A red-haired girl from Ohio asked if the German had spoken. Margaret said she didn't know. The girl shrugged. It was better that way. The day blurred in motion, Trey's thermometers the steady rhythm of pain. Orders arrived by noon supplies to be ration bandages, reserved for American soldiers. A memo pinned to the board repeated the same phrase: enemy patients receive minimal treatment. Dr. Alan Morse appeared, clipboard under his arm. Lieutenant Hale, we've got men coming in from Portsmouth. Keep your people where it matters. She nodded. I heard you stayed late last night. Checking supplies. That's not what the others said. His gaze lingered. Don't make trouble for yourself. Orders exist for a reason. She said nothing. The generator hummed between them. Morse sighed and turned away, muttering about rules keeping them sane. By afternoon, the pilot's record appeared in his careful handwriting: Richter Klaus, Luftwaffe. Severe burns, 80% body surface. Under treatment plan stood 3 words: comfort measures only. Comfort meant morphine, a damp cloth, a few words if time allowed. It meant waiting for the end politely. Mud swallowed her boots as she carried a basin past a group of orderlies smoking near the door. He's still alive, Stubborn Kraut once said. Guess hell's got a waiting list, another replied. The cruelty stung less than the tired tone. She kept walking. In Morse's office, papers cluttered the desk maps pinned to the wall. You've done good work, Lieutenant, he said. Don't ruin it over a single patient. I understand. Do you? He tapped the folder. We treat our men first. That's the rule. He's dying anyway. Then let him die by the book. We don't need saints here. He dismissed her with a nod. Dusk settled. The ward quieted to the tick of the wall clock. Across the corridor, the isolation room glowed dimly behind frosted glass. Through it, she glimpsed the pilot's face in fragments, pale skin gauze darkened by burns, a mouth opening as if to speak. The nurse inside adjusted the sheet and left. Margaret lingered, unsure if the sound that followed was breath or the building itself. The sweetness of burned sugar hung faintly in the air. Her reflection blurred beside the outline of the dying man. Down the hall, talk resumed: rations, weather, anything ordinary. She finished the day's report, ink pooled where her pen stopped. Above her desk, the order hung, edges curled from damp enemy patients receive minimal treatment. Her eyes drifted once more toward the closed door. The boy's breath came shallow. Around her, the ward returned to its rhythm. Voices, machines, distant thunder. Night dragged slow and heavy. Nurses moved quietly, careful not to wake the wounded. Margaret checked the ledger morphine vials, balanced, but unease lingered. A thin moan broke the stillness. It came again, weaker, from the isolation wing. Each step toward that door felt like trespass. The rule was clear: after hours, prisoners belonged to the orderlies. Yet the sound persisted. The German pilot lay half-covered chest, rising with effort, bandages dark with blood. He stirred, head shifting slightly, and whispered one word: mutter. The syllable barely reached her, yet it struck deep. Reflex, she told herself, any nurse would respond to that word. Still, she stepped closer. The lamp burned low. She found a basin half full of cold water, dipped a rag, pressed it gently to the scorched skin. His face tightened, then eased. The burns had erased all trace of the man he'd been. She wondered what his mother looked like. The rag came away dark. She rinsed it, replaced it, changed the outer bandage with practiced hands. Movements routine, yet something in them felt forbidden, as if the rules had stopped at the door. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. She froze. The sound faded, and she breathed again. The door creaked when she moved it, but no one came. 2 morphine doses sat unaccounted for. Her pencil hovered, then marked them as issued to Ward B. The lie came easy. She folded the stained bandage into a towel and carried it out with the waste. The floor groaned under her boots. Only the generator's hum filled the hall. Back at her desk, her pulse refused to settle. A brown smear of blood streaked her thumb. She rubbed it, but a shadow remained. A corporal appeared, clipboard in hand. "Routine check, ma'am." Margaret nodded. He skimmed the pages and left. Ink still glistened where she'd signed. If anyone checked the bins, they'd find the bandage. If they tallied morphine, the numbers wouldn't fit. The thought brought no fear, only dull indifference. Another moan drifted through the wall, less pain than surrender. Margaret rose halfway, then stopped. Nothing left to do yet. Sitting felt impossible. She poured water into a cup, hands moving on instinct, mind tracing the thin line between duty and conscience. Beyond the tents, artillery thundered faintly. Life marched forward, reports, orders, deaths, measured by schedule. Exhaustion crept in. Her pen slipped from her grasp, rolled off the desk. She left it. The smell of metal and burned cloth clung to everything, impossible to wash away. She pressed her palms together, not prayer, not yet, but close enough to unsettle her. The clock showed 3. Another hour till relief. She closed her eyes. The boy's face lingered half hidden in gauze lips, shaping that single word again. Trouble began before sunrise. A nurse from the night shift stood by the supply shelves, avoiding her eyes. Collins, soft-spoken, usually steady, looked uneasy, as if carrying a secret. When Dr. Morse entered, clipboard under his arm, Collins leaned close and murmured something low. His jaw tightened. He glanced toward the isolation wing, then back at Margaret. "Lieutenant Hale," he said evenly, "I'll need a word in my office." The room felt smaller than usual. Papers lined the walls. A coffee ring stained a memo marked "Confidential." Morse gestured for her to sit. "I've received a report," he began. Someone claims you entered the POW ward after hours. She clasped her hands. I was checking equipment, the oxygen gauge kept slipping. You know that's not the issue, he replied. The rule protects you as much as them. There was no harm done. The Army doesn't measure harm in feelings, he said quietly. It measures it in procedure. By noon, the matter reached the brass. A formal hearing assembled in the officers' tent. 3 senior staff sat behind a folding table, a colonel, a captain, and Morse. Margaret stood before them, uniform-pressed hair pinned too tightly. The smell of damp wool and tobacco filled the room. The colonel read from a page, voice steady as if reciting inventory. Lieutenant Margaret Hale, United States Army Nurse Corps, unauthorized presence in restricted quarters. He looked up. Do you deny it? I entered to verify supplies were stored properly. The captain frowned. After hours. Without a witness. Yes, sir. Silence stretched until Morse cleared his throat. She's competent, thorough, perhaps too thorough. It was meant to soften the blow, but sounded like caution. The colonel scribbled something. Effective immediately, Lieutenant Hale is relieved of direct patient care pending review. She'll report to supply and distribution. The words relieved pending distribution fell like stones. The meeting ended in the rustle of papers and scraping chairs. Morse didn't meet her eyes. Cold seeped through the tent as she stepped out. Behind the wards, a makeshift storeroom waited rows of boxes, stacked high labels blurred by rain. A corporal explained her new duties count record issue. Work for clerks, not nurses. Hours passed in the rhythm of inventory. Through the thin walls came the muffled sounds of life continuing elsewhere. Footsteps, coughing a laugh, cut short. Near dusk, Morse appeared in the doorway. I'm sorry, he said. They needed an example. So they chose me. It's temporary. Keep your head down. She wanted to ask if he believed that, but he was already leaving. We all answered as something larger, he added. Alone again, she stood among the boxes. Dust floated in the lamplight, the smell of paper and ink thick around her. Each label bore a destination, Oxford, Dover, Portsmouth. Each number precise the kind of order the Army loved. Later, carrying a crate down the corridor, she paused by a narrow window. Across the courtyard, the isolation wing glowed faintly. A nurse replaced a basin. The boy on the cot didn't stir. Her reflection blurred on the glass. Shapes moved beyond silent and unreachable. She couldn't tell if he still breathed. The thought of him lying there burns unwashed wounds, stiffening pressed against her ribs. A soldier passed calling inventory numbers. She answered automatically, hands steady. Routine hid the tremor underneath. Yet beneath the rhythm of counting, another realization tightened. Her silence had become consent. The rules now stood where she once had. When the shift ended, she walked the outer corridor. The wards shimmered behind frosted panes, each sealed world beyond her reach. She stopped by the last one and laid her palm on the cold glass. The nurses changed shifts. One adjusted the blanket over the German pilot. His chest rose faintly beneath the sheet. Margaret was restocking gauze when the young nurse from the isolation wing appeared at the doorway. Evelyn, barely 20, eyes dulled by sleepless nights, hesitated. Lieutenant, she whispered, the German's asking for someone. Keeps calling. We think he's close. Margaret set the boxes aside. Did you call Dr. Morse? He said there's nothing more to do, but I think he's trying to say something. Maybe to you. Evelyn's eyes shifted toward the corridor, as if afraid the walls were listening. You were the only one who spoke to him. Margaret set the bandage aside, checked the corridor, and whispered, I'm not supposed to be near him. I know, but if you want to, now's the time. Evelyn turned and slipped back through the doors. For a moment, Margaret stayed still. She could remain where she was, finish her shift, and no one would doubt her again. Yet the thought of that boy alone, reaching for breath, pressed in like a stone. She removed her gloves and started walking. The corridor stretched long and damp, lamps flickering overhead, typewriters drumming faintly from the admin office. She passed the storeroom, the dispensary, the memo still pinned to the board. Enemy patients receive minimal treatment. No one stopped her. The guards had gone for a smoke. She slipped through the half-open door. Disinfectant hung thick in the room. The boy lay smaller now, chest barely lifting the sheets. His lips moved soundlessly until she came near. The morphine chart showed no entry since noon. 1 dose remained. Her hands worked before thought could stop them, drawing the measure, easing the plunger until the tremor eased. He blinked, eyes dull but aware. Mutter. "It's all right," she murmured. "Danka." Mutter. The last word broke apart, then faded. She froze, syringe still in hand. His chest rose once and stilled. Procedure required logging the time, covering the body alerting command. Instead, she placed her hand over his heart. The faint warmth ebbed away beneath her palm. Boots sounded in the corridor. A beam of light slipped under the door. She hid the syringe closed. The notebook stood still until the footsteps passed. Curfew lights flared. Morse's voice echoed down the hall, calling her name. She looked once more. At the boy face, calm pain burned out. Evelyn would find him soon. The paperwork would follow, stamped and forgotten. She pressed her palm flat against his chest. "You can go now." Then the siren wailed, long rising, familiar. The hospital jolted into motion, stretchers, rolling blackout curtains, snapping shut, orders shouted down the halls. Margaret stepped into the flow of movement, uniform, damp pulse, steady. At the stairwell, she turned once. The isolation room door stood ajar, curtain fluttering from the draft. Then the lights went out. Someone pushed her forward toward the shelter. The ground shook with each blast. In darkness, her hand found the syringe in her pocket glass, still warm. No one spoke. Officers counted heads. She gave her name. Dust drifted from the ceiling. The siren faded into the drone of engines. When the all-clear came, she climbed back upstairs. Smoke lingered, but the building still stood. Evelyn met her halfway, eyes rimmed red. "He's gone," the girl whispered. "Just after the raid started." Margaret nodded. "He looked peaceful." "I thought you should know." "Thank you." Morning came muted. Margaret worked through the motions forms, filled inventories, called pages, signed no one would read. She'd slept less than an hour in the shelter upright against the wall, while others wept quietly. There was no pause for grief. Supplies needed counting damage, logged the living, tended before a memory could surface. She kept her thoughts fenced in. No one mentioned the German pilot. His bed was stripped, sheets boiled, records updated. The system had already erased him. That should have comforted her. It didn't. A courier arrived, boots caked in mud, dropped a stack of envelopes on the clerk's desk and left. One bore her name, Lieutenant Margaret Hale, U.S., Army Nurse Corps, sealed in red wax. The clerk placed it on her papers as if it were ordinary mail. She ignored it, continued tallying requisitions, answering the corporal's questions with quick precision. Morse entered, brushing dust from his sleeves. "Inspection this week," he said. "Command wants every unit's after-action report. Include casualty details." "Yes, sir." He studied her briefly. "Rough night." "We've had worse." His eyes flicked to the envelope. "Read it sooner rather than later." "I will." He left her to the silence. Hours passed. Men repaired the fence outside. Typewriters clacked in rhythm. The world resumed shape, though she drifted through it like a shadow. The envelope remained at the edge of her desk, its red seal catching light each time she moved. She imagined the words inside disciplinary action, pending breach of conduct, formal reprimand. Her stomach tightened. She wrote another line just to hear the pencil scrape the page. Numbers were simpler than consequences. Evelyn entered with a tray of supplies. They want all wards restocked before inspection. She noticed the letter. "Is that from command?" "Probably." "Do you want me to—" "No, it's fine." Evelyn left. The door clicked shut. Margaret sat back, hands raw from scrubbing. The faint scent of antiseptic lingered. She thought of the boy's last word, Danka. Mutter. She hadn't told anyone. She wouldn't. A clerk knocked. "Lieutenant Hale, Colonel's office wants your report this afternoon. I'll have it ready." He disappeared. The seal gleamed where a drop of rain had fallen. She brushed it once, tracing the ridges of the medical corps' crest, then let her hand fall. A nurse called from the hall. Margaret answered evenly. The letter waited. Time thinned. The rhythm of boots and paper filled the day. She lifted the envelope at last. It felt heavier than it should, as if the paper carried more than words. Turning it over, she found the seal still unbroken. Morse's warning murmured through her thoughts. Let it pass. Keep your head down. Then the boy's voice returned. Danka. Mutter. Her pencil rolled from the desk and struck the floor. She bent halfway, staring at the worn boards, then straightened again. The envelope lay untouched. She sat still, the letter between her palms, knowing whatever waited within would shift the world once more. At dawn came the summons. A clerk appeared at the barracks door holding a folded notice. Lieutenant Hale, he said, report to the conference room at 800. She dressed in silence, fastening each button with hands that wouldn't steady. Around her, nurses prepared for duty, whispering about the inspectors who'd arrived overnight. No one met her eyes. By the time she reached headquarters, officers stood in 2 lines along the corridor, brass buttons catching the pale light. A lieutenant colonel from the medical corps waited at the door, expression fixed by habit. Step in, Lieutenant, he said. The room felt too small for the number of people present. Maps covered one wall, a long table drowned in reports. Dr. Morse sat at the far end, unreadable. The inspector motioned for her to stand. Lieutenant Hale, this inquiry concerns allegations you violated medical protocol regarding enemy combatants. You know the directive. Yes, sir. It states, enemy patients receive minimal treatment. Did you comply to the best of my ability? A folder slid across the table. Multiple statements suggest otherwise. You administered morphine without authorization and entered the POW ward off duty. I acted on medical judgment. That distinction, the colonel replied, isn't yours to make. He passed her a pen. Write a statement. Actions between 2200 and 300 the night of the 5th. Her fingers fumbled. The lines blurred as she wrote the storm, the wounded, the confusion. Each sentence felt like lowering herself into a trench. Continue, Lieutenant. She wrote of checking the prisoner, giving a dose, staying until he died. Ink smudged beneath her hand. The clock ticked too loudly. Anything else he spoke, she said. What did he say? Danke. Mutter. Someone shifted in their chair, and you replied, I prayed for him. The words escaped too soft to recall. Silence held the room until the colonel tapped his pen. You prayed for an enemy combatant. Yes, sir. He exchanged a glance with Morse, then said, Noted. That will be all. Her name already sat at the bottom of the page. The inspector sealed the report in an envelope stamped to command review. The click of the wax press echoed like a gavel. Morse rose. Lieutenant Hale is suspended pending review. She'll surrender her credentials and remain within the compound. Yes, sir. The colonel nodded to a guard. See her out. Margaret walked the corridor in silence. The guard stopped at the nurse's quarters. You can wait here for further orders, ma'am. He hesitated. Sorry. Thank you. Under the awning, water pooled at her feet. Stretchers rolled in the distance, carts squealed across wet concrete, voices muffled by the storm. The world carried on, only her place in it had shifted. She thought of the boy's last breath, the strange calm that followed. The prayer had been small, almost nothing, yet truer than any order she'd followed. Morse appeared in the doorway, eyes weary. He gave a single nod, acknowledgement, not forgiveness. She returned it and turned away. Evening brought a thin mist clinging. Margaret sat on her cot coat, still damp. The room smelled faintly of soap and boiled water, heavy with people avoiding one another. She hadn't spoken since the hearing. Words felt dangerous, small sparks near dry straw. A knock. She ignored it, expecting another notice. It came again, softer. Morse stood in the doorway, 2 tin mugs in hand. I brought coffee, he said, stepping in without waiting. She moved aside. Steam rose between them as he set one mug down and sat across the table. The clock in the hall ticked loud enough to fill the room. "They haven't sent the report yet," he said. "It's still on my desk. I can adjust the wording if you want. Adjust, clarify, tone matters. A few lines can mean reprimand or discharge. You don't have to go down for this." The coffee was bitter strong enough to burn her tongue. "It's already written, isn't it?" "Yes, but not sealed. The colonel left the draft with me. I can say the morphine was under my orders. No one would question it." "Why would you?" "Because it's simpler. One less scandal, fewer letters. And because I've seen good nurses ruined for less." She traced the rim of the mug. Warmth steadied her fingers. "You're trying to save me." "I'm trying to save the hospital," he said, but his voice faltered. "And maybe you. If you rewrite it, what happens to the truth?" He rubbed his brow. "Truth in war is what keeps the machine running. You did your duty maybe too well. That's enough." Her voice thinned. "I prayed for him. That's what this is about." He said nothing. "I didn't plan to. It just happened." He was dying and sides stopped mattering. "Then call it compassion," he murmured. "They prefer that word. And you, necessary." The kettle whistled faintly down the hall. Someone laughed, brittle and distant. She went to the window. "You can still walk away clean," he said. "Just sign the amendment, and if I don't, then it goes as written. They'll decide." Silence stretched. "I can't sign what isn't true." "It's not about truth," he snapped. "It's about survival." "Then maybe survival isn't enough." He stopped arguing. "You could have had a career," he said softly. "The Army doesn't forgive mistakes like this. It wasn't a mistake." "I believe you mean that." He placed a folder on the table, edges damp. "I'll leave it here. If you change your mind, bring it to me before morning." She didn't reply. At the door, he said quietly, "For what it's worth. Hale, I think you did what any decent person would." Then he left. Night pressed heavy against the walls, carrying the echo of distant guns. Margaret sat alone at the desk lamp, dim hands on a blank page. One word circled her mind: traitor. It had followed her all day, whispered behind her back, traded between orderlies who no longer spoke to her. The chaplain nodded but didn't stop. The man with the morning coffee left it at the door. She told herself it didn't matter. She'd done her duty. Yet the silence had weight. It changed how people stood when she entered, how conversations died when her boots struck the floor. The hospital had already decided there were those who obeyed and those who didn't. She no longer belonged to either. The paper stayed blank. She wrote her mother's name, then stopped. For a moment, Kansas returned the porch lilacs, the hum of cicadas. Her mother's letters had always ended the same: "Keep your faith, Maggie. Do what's right, and the rest will make sense." She wanted to believe that. She wanted to write that she was proud that she'd done her job. None of it came. The pen hovered, then wrote instead, "I don't know who I am serving anymore." Ink bled through the page. She tore it in half, then another, until the fragments covered the table like dry leaves. The motion left her breathless. Silence settled again, not peace, but the kind that waited to break. Footsteps crossed the hall, paused by her door, then moved on. The handle trembled once. She didn't breathe until they faded. In the mirror above the sink, a stranger stared back, lines around the mouth, dark shadows under the eyes. The collar was straight. Habit still clung where purpose didn't. A low explosion rolled across the fields. She steadied the lamp as another blast struck nearer this time. The war felt both far away and at the door. Her hands clasped tight. Prayer failed her. Only one sentence came: "Let it mean something." The clock ticked without mercy. Generators hummed faintly through the floorboards, keeping the lights alive for no one in particular. A knock broke the stillness. Evelyn stood there, holding a folded blanket. "They say command's reviewing your case," she murmured. "Some think you'll be transferred." "Maybe." The girl hesitated. "For what it's worth, I think you did what a nurse should. That's kind of you." When she left, relief quickened her step. Margaret reopened the bin, unfolded one scrap of paper. Her handwriting stared back. "I don't know who I am serving anymore." She smoothed it flat, folded it into her pocket. A siren wailed somewhere beyond the compound. The lamp flickered. Red alert lights began to pulse, washing the walls in color. Her coat hung by the door, the same one from every night shift, each button fastened with deliberate care. Routine steadied her more than thought. The corridor glowed red. Nurses hurried past, calling to one another. Margaret joined them, falling into rhythm as if nothing had changed. At the stairwell, smoke and oil mixed in the air. For the first time in days, certainty returned. Whatever happened next, she would keep going until nothing was left to give. The first blast came just after midnight. Margaret was already moving when the second hit. Voices shouted for blackout curtains. Sirens wailed over the countryside. Nurses worked by reflex stretchers. Morphine kits' names shouted through the smoke. Engines pounded overhead, the sound like a heart too strong to stop. A shell struck close. The floor lurched. She caught the doorframe. Breath tight. An orderly stumbled past, pale with panic. West Ward's hit roofs gone. No time to think. Hands grabbed gauze scissors, anything that could be carried. Smoke filled the hall walls, trembling under another impact. The ward was chaos, half the roof gone. Beds overturned, men scattered between cots, some crying for help, others too still. Burnt plaster stung the throat. Over here, a medic yelled. Together they lifted a fallen beam, freeing the soldier beneath. He coughed blood. Margaret pressed linen to the wound. Another tremor shook the floor. A wall collapsed, sparks lighting the dark. The lights failed. In the half-glow, she worked by touch, finding pulses, tying bandages, calling for morphine that never came. A blast outside blew the door open. Shrapnel ripped the corridor. Something grazed her forehead. Warmth spread across her temple. She wiped it away, kept moving. "You're bleeding," a nurse cried. "So is everyone." They worked until the sky quieted. Bombers faded, leaving only the high ringing that follows destruction. Smoke hung low, heavy as breath. Somewhere a radio hissed through static. She stepped over plaster and glass knees, stiff sleeve torn. A glint caught her eye, a leather satchel half buried under a beam. The brass clasp still shone. CMS was stamped on the flap, the inspector's bag. Inside papers, reports, memos, her name printed across several pages. Disciplinary action, Lieutenant Margaret Hale. She gathered the pages, carried them to the broken window. Sheets slipped free, fluttering into the dark. She didn't chase them. The satchel dropped into a puddle. Water spread leather, darkening fast. She lifted a few pages, names, dissolving stamps, fading the red seal, bleeding away. A call for help broke through the quiet. 2 medics struggled with a stretcher. She joined them, steadying the load. The man moaned, his uniform scorched. Her hand pressed to his shoulder. "You'll make it," though even she didn't believe it. Margaret leaned on the wall, breath ragged. Blood trickled down her face. She tore a strip from her sleeve and bound it tight. The satchel lay nearby, contents ruined. 1 page drifted across the puddle, the letters fading before it sank. Morse appeared in the doorway, limping. "You all right?" "I think so." "They'll move us east by morning," he said. "This place won't hold another night." He noticed the bag said nothing. The silence between them said enough. He turned to help a medic with another stretcher, leaving her among the wreckage. Margaret moved slowly, body sore from bruises and cuts. The bandage on her forehead itched, but she left it alone. There was still work, though none of it belonged to her now. Her transfer slip read, "Temporary reassignment destination blank." Rumor had it her file would follow, stamped under review. She folded uniforms into a small canvas bag, motion steady, thoughtless. Each piece held the faint smell of antiseptic ghosts of a week already distant. From the yard came the creak of stretchers and engines sputtering to life. A radio hissed in the corner, weak but insistent. The BBC voice listed names of the dead, and missing each pause longer than the one before. Her hand stilled when a name surfaced, someone she'd once treated. Then another unfamiliar, another still. When the broadcast ended, static lingered until she shut it off. A nurse entered, clipboard in hand. "They're moving the last wounded," she said. "Command wants your signature on the transfer papers. Leave them on the desk." The girl hesitated. "They say you saved a German pilot. Is that true?" "He was dying. I did what anyone would. Some think you were making peace with yourself. People say whatever helps them sleep." The nurse looked down, then slipped out. The door clicked shut. Margaret sat, fatigue sinking deep into bone. The transfer papers waited, dates, signatures, codes, but each line carried quiet finality. She stood again, sorting the last of her things, a notebook, a pen, a silver cross from her mother, all wrapped in a handkerchief and tucked into her coat pocket. Reaching under the cot for a boot, her hand brushed something rough. A scrap of cloth stiff with soot, blue-gray, once now burnt to the color of ash. A faint letter showed through the fold, H. Her breath caught. She didn't need to wonder whose it had been. Footsteps passed in the hall, voices calling inventory numbers. The world went on. Margaret sat still, turning the fragment in her fingers until it cracked softly with each bend. The boy's last word returned, "Danke," mutter. Her thumb traced the letter until it blurred beneath her touch. Folded carefully, the fabric fit neatly in her palm, light as breath, fragile as forgiveness. Someone laughed too loud beyond the door, the sound slicing the quiet. She slipped the folded cloth into her pocket and buttoned the flap. A gust swept through, scattering papers. One brushed her knee, the top of her reassignment notice. Ink had bled across the words, "to be determined." She set it back, weighting it with a cup. Beyond the fence, the countryside stretched colorless. Smoke rose in thin columns against the pale sky. One by one, the engines faded until only the echo of the last truck remained. Margaret stood by the doorway, body swaying with the wind. No one called her name. No one asked questions. The silence felt both merciful and cruel. She slung the canvas bag over her shoulder and stepped forward. The ground crackled with debris. Around her, the camp lay hollow tents, half-collapsed beds, stripped bare tools left in the mud as if waiting for their owners to return. At the gate, a soldier nodded. She returned the gesture and kept walking. The road curved toward the ruined village where chimneys stood like blackened fingers. Her hand found the folded cloth again, the H pressing faintly against her palm. She didn't unfold it. Bells rang from the church down the road, uneven but persistent. She walked without hurry boots, leaving shallow prints in the damp earth. Mail arrived late that morning, carried by a young soldier whose boots left muddy tracks across the station floor. Margaret stood at the counter, sorting bandages into neat piles when he handed over a small stack of envelopes. Only one bore her name. The handwriting was precise and restrained, the same that had signed 100 reports, Dr. Alan Morse. The sight of it drew a slow tightening in her chest. She opened the envelope carefully as though the paper might bruise. A single folded sheet lay within the kind used for internal correspondence. His words were brief, as always, "Lieutenant Hale." The file concerning your disciplinary review was never recovered. Records suggest it was destroyed in the Hampshire blast. No further inquiry will be made. I thought you should know. A.M. That was all. No flourish, no sentiment, just the quiet closure of a man who believed in neat endings. Margaret sat on the bench near the door, read the note again, slower this time. The words stayed the same, but their meaning shifted the longer she stared. The war still raged. Men arrived each day, burned, broken, shaking. She dressed their wounds, filled out charts, sent them back. Yet something in her had gone still. The letter didn't absolve her. It erased her as if she'd never existed in the record at all. Beneath the folded paper lay a photograph, black and white, edges curled. A patch of ground marked by a wooden cross, no name, only a serial number burned into the wood. At its base, a single daisy, pale against the soil. The image was simple, almost accidental, but the gesture deliberate. Someone had paused long enough to leave that flower to take this picture, to send it here. Her thumb brushed the glossy surface. The petals blurred in motion, the number half visible, one she knew from the Luftwaffe pilot's tag. She didn't need to imagine who had stood there. The room seemed smaller. The letter and photo folded together under her hands, creases pressed flat. Her pulse slowed to the rhythm of the wall clock. Beyond, the glass artillery murmured over distant hills. She crossed to the medicine cabinet, slid open the drawer of unused gauze, and tucked the envelope beneath the stacks, hidden, but kept among things meant for healing. Life resumed. A cough came from the next room. Door hinges groaned, water sloshed in a basin. Her hands moved in steady precision, wringing cloth, tying bandage, closing jar, each motion, echoing something she could no longer name. At midday, she stepped out. The fields lay pale under a weak sun. Smoke from nearby farms drifted in thin lines toward the horizon. Birds circled the hedgerows, their cries faint but insistent. She drew a slow breath, the scent of soil clean cold. No bombers, no sirens, only the murmur of ordinary life returning in fragments. By the fence, wildflowers swayed between the posts, daisies 24 white and fragile, bending with the breeze. She plucked one stem, turned it lightly between her fingers, startled by its simplicity. At the gate, she paused. The petals trembled against her glove. Then she smiled faintly and let it fall, watching it drift into the grass. The kettle whistled. She poured water, stirred in the last of the powdered milk, bitter but warm. An orderly entered, asked about the day's report. She nodded, setting the cup aside. When the room cleared again, she opened the cabinet just enough to glimpse the envelope beneath the folded gauze. The drawer closed with a soft click. The clock marked the hour. Instruments straightened. Shutters opened. Morning light spread across the floorboards and glass jars catching on the rim of her cup. Margaret stood still, warmth brushing her hands. From the yard came the start of a truck engine coughing into life, then fading away. News arrived on a gray April afternoon. The radio crackled, then steadied. Germany had surrendered. For a heartbeat, the ward froze. Then chairs scraped, laughter burst loose. Nurses who had spent years whispering now shouted. Someone hugged Margaret without asking another, waved a towel like a flag. From the village came the peal of bells, slow at first, then faster as others joined. Margaret stood near the doorway listening. Joy moved through the room like light she couldn't step into. Hands hung at her sides. The young faces around her, bright, unlined, belonged to a world already drifting away from hers. An orderly offered a cigarette. She shook her head. "You'll want to remember this day," he said. "I will." The words came flat, thin, even to her own ears. By evening, the village square filled with music and children running barefoot across wet stones. Soldiers passed bottles of cider. The mayor's speech vanished under cheers. Margaret watched from the edge until the noise blurred together, then turned back toward the station. The lamps glowed, though no one was working. Those who could walk had gone to see fireworks beyond the hill. Only the clock kept time. A nurse ran past. "They've opened the prison camps," she said breathlessly. "Even the one near Hampshire. They're finding graves, temporary ones. Someone's been tending them. There are flowers, daisies." The words stayed with her long after the girl had gone. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The war was over, yet its weight still pressed close, quiet, but unchanged. Before dawn, she dressed and stepped into the street. Lamps guttered low, puddles mirrored their pale light. Her footsteps echoed on the stones as she walked toward the small chapel by the field. The door, as always, stood unlocked. Candles lined the altar flames, bending gently. She moved down the aisle, each step following its own echo. At the base of the cross lay a few flowers, daisies again, plain and white, the kind that survived through neglect. Margaret knelt. Her knees ached, but she stayed. No words came. The silence itself became prayer. She tried to recall the boy's face, the Luftwaffe pilot whose hand she had held as he died. The image had faded, but his last whisper still lingered. "Danke." Mutter. Eyes closed, she listened to the faint flicker of flame. The thought came quietly. Perhaps he had found peace long before the world did. "For those we forgot," she murmured. "For the ones we could not save." No tears, only stillness spreading through her chest. The bells began again, slower this time, fading across the fields. She waited until the last note dissolved. The years slipped quietly into one another, leaving only habits behind. Margaret lived in a narrow house near Boston Harbor, where salt crept into the window frames. She worked at a nursing home 3 blocks away among the smell of bleach wool and tea cooling on bedside tables. Life settled into rhythm morning rounds, quiet voices, the rustle of sheets, brief thanks from hands too weak to hold on. The war remained only in fragments spoken by old men who remembered sons and brothers lost overseas. Most days she simply listened. After work, she walked past the bakery that closed at dusk, the glass fogged from the ovens. Children played on the steps across the street, laughter light and unburdened. The sound warmed her, though it sometimes reminded her of the quiet after the bombs when people didn't yet know how to live again. The house was plain, 1 armchair, a narrow bed, a shelf of yellowed medical books. On the mantel sat her mother's photograph beside a brass crucifix. The faint scent of soap and paper lingered, the smell of years left undisturbed. Margaret had grown thinner, but not frail. Her hands still worked with calm precision, though an ache followed her through the evenings. Some nights, dreams carried her back to the field hospital. She always woke before dawn, sirens echoing in her chest. On those mornings, she lit a candle and let the wax run while the kettle boiled. The flame steadied her. Prayer had never come easily, but fire and water together felt close enough. One winter afternoon, a postcard waited under the door. The handwriting stopped her before she read it. Neat, deliberate, unmistakable. Morse. He'd retired years ago somewhere on the Maine coast. A photograph of a lighthouse filled the card, its beam cutting through fog. Beneath it, a single line. He died with dignity because you were there. A.M. No greeting, no date. Just that. Her fingers rested on the words until they blurred. Somewhere in the building, a neighbor played a slow tune on the piano, faltering but tender. Margaret leaned back and listened until the sound faded. Later, she opened the drawer beside her bed. It held small relics, a service badge, a worn rosary, a tin of morphine tablets long expired. Beneath them lay the folded scrap of cloth she had kept for decades, the one from the ruins after the bombing. Unfolded, it trembled in her hands. The letter H still marked the weave, faint but stubborn. Her thumb traced it once, slow and deliberate. The lamp flickered. She carried the fragment to the mantel, her quiet altar of remembrance, and placed it beside her mother's photograph. The candle burned low wax, pooling at its base. For a moment, she stood still, eyes on the cloth. The ache in her chest softened not peace but release. She thought of the boy not as guilt, not as a symbol, but as someone who had once whispered Danka with his last breath. The clock struck 7. A streetcar rattled past, shaking the panes. Margaret closed her eyes, breathing with its rhythm until the sound faded into another lifetime. When she rose, the candle was nearly gone. She blew gently. Smoke curled upward, pale and slow. The cloth stayed where it was, beside the brass cross. A breeze lifted the curtain. The frame beside the candle quivered, then settled. Margaret drew the curtain halfway. Dusk pressed against the glass, the sky the color of pewter. The street lay empty, but for a cat moving through lamplight. The quiet held deep familiar. For once it didn't weigh her down. It simply was. No ghosts remained, only stillness and the tide moving in and out beyond the walls. Margaret sat by the radio, a blanket across her knees, hands resting on the armrest. The years had carved fine lines into her face, but her eyes still held that quiet clarity, shaped by tending wounds that never closed. Her son, 16, now tall, still half a boy in the way, his voice caught, stood by the bookshelf sorting through a box of tapes. One label drew his attention, Hampshire 1943. It meant nothing to him, only that it was old. Turning it over, he asked almost casually, "Mom, did you really pray for an enemy?" The words hung between them, sharper than he meant. Wind pressed against the glass, the lamp flickered. She carried the fragment to the mantel, her quiet altar of remembrance, and placed it beside her mother's photograph. The candle burned low, wax pooling at its base. For a moment she stood still, eyes on the cloth. The ache in her chest softened not peace, but release. She thought of the boy not as guilt, not as a symbol, but as someone who had once whispered Danka with his last breath. The clock struck 7. A streetcar rattled past, shaking the panes. Margaret closed her eyes, breathing with its rhythm until the sound faded into another lifetime. When she rose, the candle was nearly gone. She blew gently. Smoke curled upward, pale and slow. The cloth stayed where it was, beside the brass cross. A breeze lifted the curtain. The frame beside the candle quivered, then settled. Margaret drew the curtain halfway. Dusk pressed against the glass, the sky the color of pewter. The street lay empty but for a cat moving through lamplight. The quiet held deep familiar. For once it didn't weigh her down. It simply was. No ghosts remained, only stillness and the tide moving in and out beyond the walls. Wind pressed against the panes, the lamp flickered. She carried the fragment to the mantel, her quiet altar of remembrance, and placed it beside her mother's photograph. The candle burned low wax, pooling at its base. For a moment she stood still, eyes on the cloth. The ache in her chest softened not peace but release. She thought of the boy not as guilt, not as a symbol, but as someone who had once whispered Danka with his last breath. The clock struck 7. A streetcar rattled past, shaking the panes. Margaret closed her eyes, breathing with its rhythm until the sound faded into another lifetime. When she rose, the candle was nearly gone. She blew gently. Smoke curled upward, pale and slow. The cloth stayed where it was, beside the brass cross. A breeze lifted the curtain. The frame beside the candle quivered, then settled. Margaret drew the curtain halfway. Dusk pressed close, the sky the color of pewter. The street lay empty but for a cat moving through lamplight. The quiet held deep familiar. For once it didn't weigh her down. It simply was. No ghosts remained, only stillness and the tide breathing in and out beyond the walls.